The freezing Chicago wind bit through my sweater as I opened the front door this Thursday morning, but the chill inside my chest was far worse. There on my porch stood David, my estranged husband, completely broken and sobbing into his hands. Just 48 hours ago, his mother, Evelyn, had stood under the harsh, fluorescent lights of the hospital corridor, looked me dead in the eye, and hissed, "Leaving you saved his life." She spoke with the absolute certainty of a woman who believed she had won. At that moment, my stomach dropped, but over the last 2 days, that devastating shock had crystallized into a cold, unshakable calm. I stood perfectly still, my fingers tightening around the heavy manila folder I was holding. I looked down at the man who had abandoned our marriage 2 months ago, knowing that the medical records in my hand were about to shatter his entire world. Before my marriage fell apart, I thought David and I could survive anything. He was a brilliant software architect who had co-founded a booming cybersecurity firm, but beneath his intellect lay a deep emotional vulnerability that left him starved for his mother's approval. I was a pediatric surgeon, dedicated to saving lives, which required long, grueling shifts at the hospital. To the outside world, Evelyn was the picture of a doting, self-sacrificing mother-in-law, always checking in and offering help. In private, however, her reality was far more sinister. She weaponized my career against me, constantly whispering in David's ear that I was a cold, career-obsessed outsider who prioritized strangers over my own husband. She positioned herself as his ultimate protector, a boundary-crossing shadow over our household. Then, 6 months ago, David suddenly fell mysteriously ill. He suffered from severe lethargy, terrifying neurological symptoms, and a brain fog that left him entirely disoriented. Evelyn swooped in instantly, rapidly seizing control of his daily routine and medical care. While I pleaded with him to let my colleagues run advanced diagnostic panels, Evelyn convinced a confused David that my demanding hospital shifts were the root cause of his physical collapse and psychological stress. She looked at me with pure triumph as she nursed him with home-cooked meals, publicly performing the role of an angel while privately poisoning his mind against me. During those dark weeks, David had signed a joint medical power of attorney, designating me as his primary decision-maker. Evelyn desperately tried to force him to revoke it, claiming I would use my medical authority to control him. I resisted, clinging to that document out of love, never realizing it would eventually become the precise key to uncovering the terrifying truth of what she was actually doing to him. The definitive breaking point arrived 48 hours ago when David suffered a sudden, severe relapse and was rushed to my own hospital. Evelyn capitalized on the chaos, positioning herself as his primary bedside companion and using the opportunity to bar me from his room entirely. She cornered me in the bustling main corridor, deliberately staging a scene to publicly humiliate me in front of the very nurses and residency students I supervised. With theatrical outrage, she loudly proclaimed to the hallway that my presence was toxic and that I was actively hindering David's recovery. When I stepped forward, speaking calmly as a seasoned medical professional to explain the clinical necessity of his baseline tests, Evelyn sneered and delivered a line that cut straight to my core. "Leaving you saved his life. His doctors say your ambition was literally killing him, and you are no longer welcome in this family." I felt the eyes of my colleagues burning into my back. Instead of giving her the dramatic outburst she wanted, I remained completely silent, observing the subtle, triumphant twitch at the corner of her mouth, and the absolute silence of David's business partner, Marcus, who stood motionless in the corner of the room. I quietly turned on my heel and walked away, letting the heavy double doors click shut behind me. I bypassed the public elevators and headed straight down the secure stairwell toward the medical records department, my heart hammering a steady, purposeful rhythm against my ribs. I didn't argue with her, because as a doctor, I had noticed something on David's admission chart that his mother didn't realize I could see, and it had absolutely nothing to do with stress. By 2 a.m., the hospital basement was entirely silent as I sat under the dim hum of the records office computer, using my high-level staff credentials to bypass the standard security blocks. For the next 24 hours, I meticulously cross-referenced David's comprehensive lab histories, internal pharmacy logs, and prior toxicology panels. What I uncovered sent a physical shiver down my spine. David was not deteriorating from a stress-induced neurological condition. His blood work from 3 separate admissions revealed low-grade, persistent traces of unprescribed heavy sedatives, specifically the potent anti-anxiety medication that, when combined with his daily vitamins, induced severe cognitive confusion and lethargy. The horror deepened the following afternoon when I accessed our synchronized home server and flagged an encrypted thread of corporate emails sent during his worst medical episodes. Evelyn and David's business partner, Marcus, had been operating in lockstep. They were actively utilizing his prolonged medical absence and induced mental incompetence to draft a hostile corporate buyout, aiming to strip David of his $2 million ownership share in the cybersecurity firm for pennies on the dollar. While they assumed I was nursing my wounded pride in defeat, I shifted into a state of absolute clinical resolve. I quietly coordinated an emergency meeting with a forensic toxicologist to formalize the blood panel analysis and simultaneously retained an aggressive corporate attorney. By Thursday morning, we successfully executed a legal freeze on all our joint marital assets and investment accounts, effectively bottlenecking the liquidity Marcus needed to finalize the fraudulent corporate restructuring. Throughout this entire silent operation, my phone vibrated constantly with a barrage of hostile emails and text messages from Evelyn. She repeatedly attached digital copies of expedited divorce papers, demanding I sign them immediately to prove I had an ounce of decency and finally let David heal in peace. She believed her psychological warfare had broken me, completely unaware that every single message she sent was being automatically forwarded into a secure legal evidence file. I let her believe she was winning, watching the clock tick down toward Friday afternoon, knowing the entire trap was locked and ready to spring. David stood on my porch, trembling as the freezing wind swirled around him, his face streaked with tears. The moment I stepped aside and motioned him into the warmth of the foyer, he collapsed conceptually into the role of the victim, expecting to confront a bitter, vengeful ex-wife who had frozen his accounts out of spite. Instead, he was met with the cold, clinical precision of a surgeon saving a life. I didn't yell, and I didn't offer a comforting embrace. I simply walked into the kitchen and pointed to the heavy black binder resting under the overhead lights of the marble island. "Open it, David," I said, my voice cutting through his panicked breathing. With shaking hands, he turned the pages, his eyes widening as he stared at the toxicologist's signed affidavit detailing the exact chemical sequence of the sedatives found in his bloodstream. Before he could even process the medical data, I tapped a button on my laptop, playing a recorded phone call with the chief hospital pharmacist. The clear, recorded audio filled the kitchen, confirming that Evelyn had used an outdated medical proxy to pick up those exact unprescribed sedatives from the clinic pharmacy every 2 weeks. I then flipped the page to the corporate buyout drafts, highlighting the signature lines where Marcus had already signed, awaiting only a forced power of attorney signature from Evelyn. The contrast was devastating. David had come to accuse me of destroying his financial stability, only to realize I was the only person standing between him and total ruin. In real time, I watched his psychological conditioning shatter. The fog of his mother's gaslighting finally cleared as the irrefutable evidence proved that Evelyn hadn't saved his life. She had been systematically poisoning his body and dismantling his marriage to steal his life's work. The legal and corporate fallout was immediate and devastating. By Monday morning, armed with the binder of irrefutable evidence, David's corporate counsel blocked the fraudulent buyout and initiated a mandatory restructuring of the cybersecurity firm, stripping Marcus of his executive voting rights. David cut all communication with his mother and filed a formal police report regarding the medical tampering. To avoid imminent criminal charges, Evelyn hastily sold her belongings and fled the state, leaving her financially ruined and socially disgraced among her peers. Once the dust settled, David returned to my doorstep, begging for reconciliation and a chance to rebuild our life together. But as I looked at him, I knew that saving his life didn't mean instantly restoring his place in mine. I enforced an ironclad boundary. I instructed my lawyer to pause the divorce proceedings, but I flatly refused to let him move back into our home. "You need to heal, David, but you have to do it on your own," I said calmly. I demanded he commit to extensive independent trauma therapy to address the deep-seated enmeshment that allowed this to happen before I would ever consider opening my heart to him again. There was no triumph in my voice, only a profound sense of self-respect. I reached into my coat pocket and slid a metal key across the table toward him. It belonged to a quiet, leased apartment across town, a place where he could finally learn to stand on his own 2 feet. This entire experience taught me a brutal truth about narcissistic family dynamics. A toxic parent will gladly destroy your health just to control your narrative. For months, I blamed myself for not doing enough, but protecting someone sometimes means stepping back and letting them hit rock bottom so they can finally see who is actually holding the shovel. Today, I am moving forward with absolute personal peace and an unshakable sense of self-worth. David has a long road of healing ahead of him, and while I hope he finds his way, my survival is no longer tied to his recovery. Looking back at how quickly the truth came to light, I have to ask you, what would you have done in my position? Would you have given him a second chance to heal? Or was the betrayal of him believing his mother over his wife simply too deep to forgive? Let me know your thoughts in the comments below. Thank you for listening to my story, and always remember that choosing yourself is never a mistake.